Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 5 of Scientist Chats. Thank you for joining us again today. As usual, just have a few notes before we begin. So again, I ask all attendees under the age of 13 to please have a parent or guardian there to supervise you. I also want to remind everyone that these sessions are being recorded. So as usual, we are doing this in preparation for the Let's Talk Science Challenge. There will be a quiz held tomorrow, Thursday, May 14th. This is quiz 5. So as usual, there's a quiz at 10 to 11 a.m. for the Eastern time, an English quiz, as well as one from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific time. There's also a French quiz being held from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern time. So this week's topic is focused around biology, specifically plant biology. So we'll be looking at topics such as plant cells and their structures, plant taxonomy, parts of the plants, plant reproduction, and plant functions. So if we just take a quick look at the website, we'll be looking into the plant structure and functions, looking at cell theory, some of the features of a plant cell, such as cell walls, and as well as the functions, what makes them unique, the ability to photosynthesize, and what. As well as we'll be looking over a bit of plant taxonomy, which our guest today is actually going to give us a little bit of an overview of some of these. So it should be pretty interesting. And I'm pretty excited about our guest today. So I'll try to get through this intro as quick as possible. So our guest today is Leigh Paulseth. She is the Enrichment and Outreach Coordinator at Let's Talk Science. So Leigh has a bachelor's in conservation biology, as well as a master's in resource and environmental management. As well as Leigh and I have been working together for about a year now. So I'm pretty excited about this session today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Leigh.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adisa. I'm very excited to be here. It's a little bit odd for me because I've been helping Adisa out kind of in the background of these programs. And so now it's a little bit odd for me to be front and center. But anyway, we're gonna try it. Here we go. So my background is in conservation biology, and I've worked in kind of protected areas, management, parks, trying to protect endangered species, that type of thing, for quite a while now. And then for the past 3 years, I've joined the team at SciXchange at Ryerson, doing a lot of community engagement. And you'll kind of see how I made that transition in a little bit. But first, I'm going to start with my good friend Carl. This is Carl Linnaeus, and he is the father of taxonomy. So Adisa touched on that a little bit. Taxonomy is basically how we organize how all life on Earth is related to each other. So if you think of like your family tree and how you're related to your parents and cousins, your aunts and uncles, your grandparents, and it can go back and back, taxonomy is basically like that, but looking at all of the diversity of life on Earth. And so Carl studied at Lund University in Sweden, and I visited there a number of years ago. So I got to take a picture with Carl, which was exciting for me. And I rarely get to nerd out about seeing things like this around the world. So I thought this was a good excuse to use this picture. So just before we get too much into plants, I want to talk about cells and specifically organelles. So I'm not a cell biologist, but I did want to just bring your attention to one really cool organelle in our cell. If you think of a cell, each individual cell in our body, like an entire human body, the organelles are like all of the organs in our bodies that work together to make the cell work, right? So each organ has a function. Our heart pumps our blood around, our liver cleans a lot of that blood for us, our stomach digests the food that we eat, So all of these different organelles in our cell are providing different functions. This is a photo of our office a few years ago during Pride decorating. And June is Pride Month, so we sadly won't be able to decorate our office because we won't be there this year. So I thought I'd do a little throwback to how we decorated a few years ago. And I want to introduce you to Ronnie the ribosome. So Ronnie is a ribosome, which is a type of organelle in our cell. And ribosomes are the ones that actually translate our DNA into something useful. So DNA holds all of the information that our cell needs to function. And so kind of think of it like a library of books, but if you don't know how to read, then all of the information in those books isn't really accessible to you. So what the ribosome does is it is able to read all of that information in the DNA and process it into proteins that actually go and do work within your cell. So that's Ronnie the ribosome. And I will get back onto track of what our talk is supposed to be about today, which is plants. So I've been really lucky to be able to do a bunch of field work in my lifetime. And so field work is basically what biologists do outside. So we don't work in labs a whole bunch. We like to go outside, run around, find cool things. So this is a photo of me in California where I got to do my very first field biology course. And this is in Northern California at a park called Point Reyes. And we were actually trying to find caribou at this park, which was really fun. We did find caribou. There's a whole bunch of them. Now, I like to study plants because they stay in one place. And so it's very easy to find them again. It's very easy to locate them. And so that's kind of where I gravitated towards. But of course, I love all life on Earth. And so it was really fun to do that. While I was doing this field studies course, I got to see kind of how scientists work outdoors. And so this is an outdoor lab. You can see at the bottom of the picture on the left, there's actually a hummingbird on there. So I have a picture of a nice hummingbird there. And what we're doing is we're tagging the hummingbird. And so we put a very small piece of plastic on the hummingbird's foot, and it allows us to identify where that hummingbird has been, and so that other scientists can track it other places that they catch the hummingbird as well. So that's just one of the techniques that scientists use in the field, and they have to bring all of their equipment with them. When I was in California, I studied a small bush called a tamarack, and I got really confused because this species was actually not native to North America. And so when I went back to Ontario, where I did my undergraduate degree, I kind of knew about this tamarack bush, and I would look up what some of the other native plants were in Ontario, and there's a tamarack tree in Ontario. It's also called a larch tree, and it has no relation to a tamarack bush that I found in Northern California. And so it was very confusing for me. But that's one of the reasons why taxonomy is so important, is because it allows us, no matter what language we talk in, it allows us to properly identify what species are what by using their Latin name, which is a language that not a lot of people use anymore. It used to be used very frequently in Europe, and so that was the language that was chosen for all of our taxonomic names. But nowadays we name things usually with Latin bases to them, but it just allows scientists to work across languages, which is really, really cool. Okay, I'm finally going to get back to, nope, not getting back to plants yet. Because look at this turtle, it's so cute. So one of the first jobs that I had was working with a number of land trusts. And land trusts are really interesting organizations. They're all about protecting the environment, but the way that they protect the environment is by conserving and protecting private land. So if you wanted to go camping, for instance, usually you would go to a provincial park or a national park, and these are parks that are run by our government and protected for other people like you and me. These private nature reserves from land trusts are protected solely for nature, which is really, really cool. These are people that are donating their land because they don't want their property to be developed in the future, like after they die, and the land gets passed down to someone else. So while I was working for these land trusts, both in Nova Scotia and in Ontario, I got to do really cool things like track endangered species. Now this guy here is a wood turtle, and wood turtles are endangered in Canada. And it's one of the reasons that they're endangered is because look how cute he is. He's so adorable. And people really like to collect these guys as pets. But of course, if you take them out of their natural habitat, they're not able to perform some of the ecosystem services that they normally would. And so that's why their population is so low. So I'm actually not allowed to tell you where this picture was taken. Because it's an endangered species, it's protected by law. And so by law, I'm not actually allowed to tell you where I found this guy. Makes it really easy for me because I actually can't remember where this picture was taken. It was on the side of the road somewhere, but I couldn't even tell you, you know, kind of what area of what province it was taken in. All right, now we're getting back to plants. So just gonna see if anyone happens to know what this plant is. I'm just going to run a poll. So just make a guess, add in whatever you think it might be. I see some answers coming in. That's awesome. Thank you. Okay, I'll close it down in 5, 4, 3. Get your answers in. 2, 1. All right. So most of you guessed correctly. This is poison ivy. Very good. I always like to show people what poison ivy looks like. I'll put that away. And so if you see my mouse here, the way that I always like to identify poison ivy is we know that it has 3 leaves. And those leaves are arranged, there's 2 that are directly across from each other. And then there's one, that 3rd leaf is perpendicular or at a right angle to the original 2 there, okay? So we can see this one, there's 2 across from it, and there's a 3rd one that's perpendicular. 2 across down here, 3rd one is perpendicular. And poison ivy looks different in different parts of North America, which for me is terrifying because I happen to be really allergic to it. There is a small population of people who are not allergic to poison ivy. I don't suggest you go and test out whether you are one of those people because the vast majority of us are allergic to poison ivy. Usually we just get, you know, a rash, it's kind of itchy and irritating. For people like me, I actually get 2nd-degree burns from poison ivy. So you can see the blisters on my arm here. That's essentially a 2nd-degree chemical burn from poison ivy because I'm so allergic to it. So when I worked in ecological restoration after I worked for a number of land trusts, I did a lot of tree planting, and we would sometimes be trying to restore areas that had lots of poison ivy in it, so I had to be super careful. And a lot of the time what we would have to do is monitor a site for a year or two before we go onto it to restore it, so that we knew what species were growing there, because it's hard to know whether poison ivy is at a site if you go there, say, in October, when the poison ivy has died and gone dormant for the winter. So it's really important that we monitor sites for an entire calendar year before we go onto them to do restoration work. All right, so one really cool function about plants is that they can photosynthesize. And what that means is they actually create food for themselves. They take light and they take carbon dioxide out of the air and water. They combine those things and they create sugar. You and I, in order to function, we need to eat stuff, right? We can't make our own energy, but plants actually create their own energy, which is really awesome. And so in order to do that, hopefully you can see the video. The plants are moving very, very slowly. So this video was taken over a 5-hour period. And what happened was I started to grow some lettuce, and the lettuce automatically wants to grow towards the sun because it wants to get as much sun as possible. And so I had it sitting in front of a window, and what I did is I just turned the tray all the way around opposite so that the lettuce was facing away from the window. And over the course of the day, it could feel that the sunlight was coming from the window. You can see the window behind the tray there. And it started actually moving and growing towards the light. And that happened in a matter of a few hours. So yeah, plants are super cool. It's one of the reasons why we call them primary producers, because tons of animals, including humans, especially humans who are vegetarian, depend on the sugars that plants are able to produce for themselves in order to sustain themselves. All right, so I mentioned after I worked for Land Trusts, I went on to work for an organization that did ecological restoration. And basically what we did is we tried to restore forest habitat to land that had been disturbed. And I did this actually in Toronto, in the GTA, which is where I'm from. And we did a lot of work out in the Rouge, in the east end of Toronto. And so this is a pine tree that I planted. And one thing that we had to make sure we were working on as we were doing our ecological restoration is thinking about creating a forest from scratch, which is really cool. It's really fun. We actually had to be really creative in order to do that. And we needed to be able to look at what did we want the forest to look like 5 years from now? And what did we want it to look like 20 years from now? And so we actually had to seed in different types of trees, different types of bushes, and different types of flowers because we wanted a wide diversity within our restoration sites. The other thing that we had to make sure that we did is to try to increase not just the plant life on our restoration sites, but also the animal life on our restoration sites. So we would actually put up really tall poles on our sites so that hawks and other birds of prey could come and land on the poles and be encouraged to use our restoration sites. Now, we also kind of sneakily used these people or these hawks to help us out as well, because the main threat to our restoration sites wasn't people, it was actually rodents. So little mice, voles, rabbits would come and chew the baby trees that we had planted. And because the trees were so small, any kind of chewing or disruption to them could actually kill the trees. So these really cute little rabbits and voles could kill our trees. We didn't want that to happen. So we encouraged hawks to visit our restoration sites so that they could keep the rodent populations down, which was really cool. So obviously, when we're doing restoration, we want to make sure that we're doing a lot of, that we're planting a lot of native species, because we want to increase the number of native species in our restoration sites. However, we also have to battle something called invasive species. And this grass here in the foreground here, this is my arch nemesis. It's called Phragmites, and that's one of the Latin names that we use. The full name for the grass is Phragmites australis, but people generally just call it Phragmites. And it is a really aggressive, tall grass. And it's really aggressive because it can actually grow in a lot of places. And once it becomes established in that place, it can spread and take over entire fields. So you can actually see it growing in the background of this field here. So all of that kind of brown stuff at the back there, that's all Phragmites, and it's starting to actually cover the entire field. Now, the problem with this is that when you have just one species that covers an entire field, it means that there's no other diversity at that site. And so if you're an animal trying to use that field, if you can't eat the Phragmites, if you can't nest in the Phragmites, then that entire field becomes useless to you. You can't do anything in that area. Whereas if you have a field that has a whole bunch of different flowers and grasses and bushes, then animals will be able to eat the berries, they'll be able to nest in the grass, they'll be able to use the different areas within that field in order to survive. I have another invasive species here. This one is actually from my garden. You can take a look. It does have a pretty white flower, and it's in bloom right now, and it's called garlic mustard. So garlic mustard is an invasive species from Europe, and it is here because people like to plant it in their gardens. You can eat it, you can eat the leaves, and I know people who live in the UK actually make delicious pesto out of this. But it is very invasive here because it takes over the understory of forests, and it doesn't allow other flowers and native plants to grow underneath those trees. All right. So, and we don't have to worry just about invasive plant species. There's also a lot of invasive animals and bugs as well that can impact the plants that are here in North America. And so this one is, I'll just start the video and pause it. So you can see all of the little grooves on the wood here. All of those grooves were made by a bug called the emerald ash borer. You may have heard of it before. It's been in North America and it's been a really big problem for a few years now. And what it does is it burrows underneath the bark of the tree, and it's done it so much to this tree that it's actually killed it. The tree has been dead for so long that all of the bark has peeled off of it, and so you'll be able to see as we continue the video that it's just standing, but it's completely dead. And the bugs have gotten all the way up the wood to the very top, and there's no life in those branches anymore. So that tree will eventually fall down and decompose into the forest. So why is it that we need to do the work that, that folks in ecological restoration and conservation biology need to do? Well, it's because we depend on nature for so many things. This here is a native wildflower. It's called a cup plant. And this is a little bumblebee that's trying to get nectar from that flower. And bees are super important because they pollinate all of our food. We wouldn't have food unless if it weren't for the bees. And so it's really important for us to maintain these natural areas, not only because the plants give us air that we can breathe, purify our water and purify our air, but also because we depend on those natural areas for so many other what we call ecosystem services. And so these are things like reducing flooding in and around our cities, animals that are pollinating our food. So all of these things contribute to human societies being able to function, and that's why our natural areas are so important. The last plant that I want to share with you in picture form is this mayapple. And mayapples are really cool. They're also known as mandrakes, but they're not like the mandrake roots in Harry Potter. They're not going to scream when you take them out of the ground. But they do have really cool fruit. It's kind of like a cross between an apple and a lemon. And it's native to North America. It's really odd for us, especially up here in Canada, to have a fruit that's kind of citrusy. But the fruit is actually toxic. So you can eat maybe one of these a year, but you don't actually want to eat very many of them because too much of the toxins will build up in your system and you'll get sick. So that's a really cool one. All right. The last thing I want to do is just share a few other plants that I have here, because a lot of the content that is going to be in the challenge this week has to do with the types of plants that we have here in North America. So the first one I'm going to share is my lovely fern. And this guy, I've kept alive for 3 years. I'm very proud of it. Despite being, you know, a restoration ecologist, I'm actually really terrible at keeping houseplants alive. So this one has been alive for 3 years. I'm very proud of it. Ferns are really cool because they are part of our plant life that don't have flowers or seeds. They actually replicate through spores. And so they send the spores out into the world. They usually get picked up by the wind. They land in the soil and they start to grow again. So that's really interesting. And they're actually one of the oldest types of plants on Earth. They were one of the first ones to evolve. And they're also closely related to moss, which is really interesting because we don't think of mosses and ferns as being very similar, but they both reproduce by spores. Speaking of reproduction, a question that I always get is what's the difference between trees that have needles and trees that don't have needles, have like leaves that fall down. And so the trees that have needles, we call them conifers. And I remember that because they have cones. Conifers, kind of cone-ish in the name, and so they'll have cones. This cone is from a spruce tree. And this is the needles of a eastern white cedar tree. And cedar is a really beautiful tree. It can actually live really, really long. In Ontario, where I am, it actually can live for almost 1,000 years. And so you can find some really old cedar trees in Ontario, and they're some of the oldest living organisms here in this part of Canada. The last thing I'm going to show you is a succulent. We don't have many native succulents here in Canada, and that's because we tend to have a pretty temperate ecosystem, which means that we get rainfall. The rainfall might actually come in the form of snow in the winter, but it's still lots of moisture. And the reason that we don't have succulents is because succulents have evolved to live in really dry conditions. So one thing that plants have that animals like humans don't have are called stomata. And stomata are little holes in the leaf of the plant that allow for the exchange of air and water to happen. And so that's how the plant is able to draw in air to create those sugars that it needs. And so what succulents have been able to do is, you can see that it's a very waxy leaf. You can see how shiny it is. And that's because it's evolved to not have very many stomata, because when you open up those holes to allow air to come in, you also lose a lot of water. And so it's evolved to be able to try and maintain as much of that water as possible, which is why we sometimes think of it as being really waxy. It's because it's trying to keep as much moisture in as possible, because generally it is living in desert conditions where it's really, really dry, and so it wants to hold on to as much water as possible. So that is it for my plant presentation. I did stray a little bit into mammals and animals, but yeah, I'd love to hear some of your questions.
Very, 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 very nice talk, Leigh. It's very interesting what a lot of these plants could do. A lot of us don't, we don't really think of plants as being interesting all the time, but they're super interesting, So we have a few questions before people ask them in the chat. We got a few questions ahead of time. So one of the questions is, as I was mentioning, a lot of people don't consider plants as being all that interesting, unfortunately. But one of the questions is, why is plant biology so important, and how does it affect us in our everyday life?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I do looks at kind of a whole bunch of plants together. So I look at, how do we restore an ecosystem to make sure that everything's working together to provide those ecosystem services. But if you think about individual plants, we get a ton of stuff from individual plants. So we eat a lot of plants. The things that we eat a lot of plants, right? We wouldn't be able to have chicken or beef or pork if those animals aren't able to eat plants. And then we get a lot of things like medicines, and even some of the studies now looking at how are we going to create an antivirus for the coronavirus. A lot of that is taking tests from things that have been research that's been done on plants, research that's been done on cultivating different medicines from plants, and trying to see how we can relate those plant properties to something that can help human health.
So plants are important for medicine. It's very nice. So we have a few questions here from the chat. So first question is, what's your favorite plant?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm gonna say I have a lot of favorites. I'm gonna say the tulip tree, which isn't very common here in Canada, but it is native to this area, and we do want to try and plant more of these trees because they're part of what's known as the Carolinian ecosystem. And that's the ecosystem that starts way down in the Carolinas in the US and comes all the way up just to the northern part of Lake Ontario. But with climate change, more and more of those species are able to survive in Canada. And so we actually want to make sure that we're planting those species so that they're able to help us with adaptations for climate change within Ontario and within Canada.
So another question here is, do you remember all the names of the plants and animals that you come across? All the scientific names, actually.
No, definitely not. I had to learn a whole bunch of scientific names when I was doing some studies in undergrad when I was in university. But to be honest, I don't remember many scientific names anymore. I call them by their common name, so what they're kind of known most commonly as. And then if I'm talking to a researcher or a scientist and I need to know their scientific name, I just Google it or I look it up in my plant book.
That's a very good answer. I do the same.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that the tulip is your favorite plant. Would you say it is the most interesting plant to you?
I don't think it's the most interesting one because it's a flowering tree. It flowers really early in the year, and those are really important because it provides like pollen and nectar to our birds and bugs early in the year, which is really great. But I mean, there's a lot of really cool plants out there. There are carnivorous plants. There are plants that actually eat bugs. So yeah, there's so many cool plants out there, and I'm still learning so much about different ones and what they can do and how they do it. That even, there are really cool things like filming that lettuce turning towards the sun, like that's so cool. Are you kidding me? Like, it's amazing. So yeah, there's really cool stuff happening with plants all the time. And spring is one of my favorite times of the year, I would say, because you get to see all of the buds coming out. So I love this time of year because of that.
No, perfect. So another question here is, do plants have parents?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Most plants do have parents. They need to be plants that are grown from seeds. Those seeds come from the combination of sperm and egg, the same way that we do it, that happens with mammals. And so we need that combination of parent A and parent B in order to create that germinated seed that can then grow. There are some plants that don't reproduce that way. They reproduce by clones, which is really cool. And so they can actually just send out a root or a shoot underneath the ground and create a whole new plant that is identical to the parent plant. And so that doesn't involve any kind of recombination of DNA. They are an exact replica of their parent. So not all the time.
What inspired you to become a biologist?
So when I was in high school, I was really good at math and science. And so when I went to university, I went into the sciences, and I kind of just automatically thought that I was going to be a doctor. Because I didn't have a ton of imagination. And to me, the only thing that you could do with science was to become a doctor. I hadn't spent any time trying to think about what other things you could do with science. And there's so many things. So then in first year biology, my prof, I was in a class with 600 students. My prof said, look to your left, look to your right. Who wants to go to med school? We all put up our hands. And he said, well, statistically, none of you are going to med school. There's going to be 3 people out of a class of 600 that are going to go to med school. And so I was like, well, geez, that's a reality check. Do I really want to go to med school? And when I thought about it, I'm afraid of blood. I really don't like needles. Biology is really cool to me, but I would much rather spend time outside, and I would much rather study the biology of plants and how organisms work together. And so once I spent some time thinking about that, it became really obvious to me that I actually didn't want to become a doctor at all. And that is not to say that med school is impossible, because I had friends in my class and they were like, I'm going to be one of those 3 people. I'm going to do it. And every single one that said like, yes, I absolutely want to become a doctor is a doctor right now, which is really amazing. They worked really hard. They weren't always the smartest people in the class, but they knew what they wanted and they worked really hard to get it. So I think the important thing is that you think about what you're really passionate about. And I remember telling my parents that I was going to do conservation biology instead of like medical biology. And they were like, oh, but what are you going to do? And I was like, I don't know. I'm going to play in parks. I'll worry about that after. And I was really lucky. They were very supportive of me. Yeah, I definitely didn't always know what kind of biologist I wanted to be. But I'm really lucky to be able to have ended up where I am.
I think a lot of us who are scientists and didn't go into medicine get that question.
Right? Yeah.
Oh boy. So how will you mark the International Year of Plant Health?
So I just found out about this, and I don't really know. My partner has a really big green thumb. He's very good at growing things, and so I think we might build a greenhouse and start trying to grow a lot of our own food. So I think that might be the way that we celebrate it. That's a good question, though. I'm going to have to think more about it.
All right. Let me see. Do you happen to know which plant makes up the most of the medicines that we use?
So the really cool thing about medicine is that it uses so many different kinds of plants. There's not just like one that we always go to and we're like, oh yeah, no, don't worry, like we can get that medicine from this plant. Usually there's one plant that has developed some kind of special adaptation, and that allows us to harvest some kind of medicinal value from it. So for instance, willow bark has ASA, which is the basic ingredient of aspirin. And so indigenous peoples in North America would chew on willow bark when they had toothaches, because they knew that it had that pain-killing property to it. And so the way that Western scientists figured out how to make that is because they learned from the indigenous people that they would chew the willow bark. So they're like, oh, we know there must be something in the willow bark that's making their pain go away, so let's study it more, right? Which is one of the reasons why we need to protect biodiversity. We want to make sure that we have as much biodiversity to draw from, because you never know where that next cure is going to come from.
Okay. If someone plants a tulip plant in Newfoundland, would it grow?
It's a good question. Likely not. You might get lucky. Newfoundland is definitely outside of the Carolinian ecozone. And the winters are a lot harsher there than they are in southern parts of Canada. So probably the tulip tree would not be able to live through their winters, is my guess. But you never know. I would say if you're trying to look for adaptations to climate change in Newfoundland, take a look at what's growing well in Nova Scotia, just a little bit south, right? And then see if there are species that are growing there and not growing in Newfoundland yet, and maybe those are the ones that are going to do well in warmer climates.
Okay. So yeah, just have a few more questions here. why is the mitochondria, so we're going towards cells now a bit. So it's why is the mitochondria called the powerhouse of the cell?
Oh, okay, you're really bringing me back to cell biology here. So Adisa, you might have to correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you you do some of the bio TAing. Mitochondria, that's where the conversion of energy happens in the cell. So in all cells, in plants and in humans, it's where, it's where energy is created for us to use in order to operate. And so that's why we call it the powerhouse. Adisa, do you have anything to add?
It's one of those topics you could go on for a long time with, but you pretty much summed it up, yeah. Parts of like the glycolysis process happens there, so that's why it's referred to as such, yeah.
And glycolysis is like the breaking down of sugar molecules, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, final question. I think we could ask like one more. What would you say is the most effective way to get rid of weeds?
The most effective way to get rid of wheat?
Weeds.
Oh, weeds. Well, I am not a huge proponent of pesticides, because I think putting chemicals into the earth isn't going to do anyone any good in the long run. Most weeds have just been named weeds because they're inconvenient for humans. But a lot of them are actually native species that provide a lot of benefit to other organisms, right? So dandelions, you can actually eat the leaves of dandelions, and they're medicinal. They're really good for your urinary tract system. So it's actually a lot of things that we consider weeds are actually not bad things. I try not to get rid of my weeds. And if there are things that are invasive, I always try to manually remove them as much as possible. So that means pulling them out. You can see that I've pulled out my garlic mustard. I pulled out as much of the root as possible. And I've pulled out that root when the garlic mustard has flowered and already put lots of energy into growing lots of leaves and to growing the flower, which is very energy intensive, but it hasn't created seeds yet. So it's not actually propagating in other places. And so you pull that root out when it's expended the most of its energy to try and get rid of it. Usually some of the root still remains, and you might have to do that a few times in a season or over a few years. But hopefully you can start to reduce the population of the plant that you don't want by doing that continually.
Okay. And let me see if there's any more. Any final questions? Okay, so one final question. What is the best way to keep a plant alive in a house?
You're asking the wrong person.
All right.
Yeah, so I mentioned I'm decent at keeping plants alive outside. Not very good at keeping houseplants alive. But from what I've learned, watering it enough but not too much is key. And so one thing that I do with my fern is I actually just like poke the soil to see how much water there is. And different plants like different things. So my fern actually really likes it to be quite moist. And so I need to make sure that I water it a few times a week. With my succulent, These guys, because they're used to living in really dry areas, they actually don't need a lot of water. So we kind of add, maybe a few drops of water once a week, and that's enough. That's all it needs. And if you kind of try and touch the soil, you actually want to make sure that the soil for our succulent is pretty dry most of the time. So yeah, you sometimes have to do a bit of research about what plant you have and what conditions they like, and then try to recreate those conditions inside your house. The other thing is sunlight, so making sure that they're getting enough light, and whether they need that light to be direct, which means that they actually get the sun on them all the time, or indirect, which means they're near a window, and so there's sunlight coming through the window, but the sun can't actually get to the plant directly. So that's the difference between direct or indirect sunlight.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not an expert on indoor plants. I'm sorry. I'm really terrible at them.
Okay, perfect. And with that, I would like to thank Leigh for being our guest today. Leigh, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just, there's lots of ways to explore plant life, even from your window, especially during these lockdown times. So get outside, start exploring. This is a great time to start exploring and learning more about plants. When you start, it seems really daunting because there's so many different kinds of plants. And so just kind of start one at a time, use a book, use the internet, and you'll start getting the hang of it as you get going.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Well, someone said that they think they like plant biology now, so thank
Yay!
you. Very good job. Very good job. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. For anyone whose question wasn't answered in the live chat, we will definitely be getting them to you in the form of our newsletter. So thank you for joining us and have a good day.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.